Now I'm so pleased to welcome Koethi Zan to discuss her novel, The Never List. The book is a story of a girl who was abducted while in college and, after surviving her captivity, struggles to resume a normal life. Ms. Zan has said that her fascination with the crime genre began with The Silence of the Lambs, and her admiration for women like Sabine Dardenne and Elizabeth Smart, who were able to survive and recover from their own abductions. The Never List is captivating and chilling, especially in light of the recent release of the Cleveland kidnapping victims, whose story is eerily similar to the one told in the book. A lawyer by training, Miss Zan always thought she'd write a crime novel, and we're so pleased that she finally has. Please join me in welcoming Koethi Zan.
I'm so pleased to be here at Politics and Prose. You know, I'm just from a little town in rural Alabama, and I never thought I would get to be doing this at such a prestigious bookstore. I'm very excited. So, like half the population of DC, I'm a lawyer, as you heard, and but like many lawyers, I always thought of myself as maybe something else, and I always had this urge to be doing something creative, though I wasn't exactly sure what that was, and I got into law mostly as a way to get out of rural Alabama. And then what I always say is that my favorite New Yorker cartoon really explains all of it, which is that it's a little boy and he's all dressed up in his cowboy outfit, and he looks up at his dad and says, well, if I can't be a cowboy, I'll be a lawyer for cowboys. And that's how I got into entertainment law. So I spent the last 8 years working at MTV. And I was working on reality shows like The Hills and The City and what else did I work on? Asia. And True Life. And so I kind of like to say that right now I feel like I'm in an episode of True Life. I'm a crime novelist. But I had for a long time before I wrote this book thought, oh, one day I'd like to write a crime novel. And I just kept saying that one day I'll write a crime novel. And finally I decided that if I didn't do it, I was just never going to do it, because I knew that I was, being a lawyer, too risk averse to quit my job and just write a book. So I would get up at 5 a.m. Every day, and I gave myself a word count, and I had to write 500 words a day, 5 days a week. And I gave myself a little incentive plan that if I hit 10,000 words in any calendar month, then I could take the rest of the month off. And even though writing is, the most pleasurable, wonderful thing I've ever done, the only thing that's more pleasurable than writing is not writing. So I noticed that I kept finishing earlier and earlier each month. So you heard a little bit of the description of the book, and I'll just give you a little bit more of that. So it's about Sarah Farber, who's at the time of the events of the book, she's 31 years old, and she was abducted in her college years along with her best friend and held captive in a basement along with 2 other women. And now it's 10 years later, and she's still struggling psychologically to recover from the abduction, and she's grieving over her best friend who didn't make it out. And now her abductor is up for parole, and he's sending her these twisted letters from jail. And he's sort of leading her into another mystery, and she realizes that she is going to have to face her past in order both to heal and to keep him in jail. And the title, the Never List, comes from, oh, no, I'm going to do that in the reading. Never mind. You'll learn what the Never List is. So, when I wrote this book, I think probably a lot of people were surprised that I would write something that's so dark, because I seem like, such a, responsible lawyer, and, I have a nice sunny disposition. And so people wanted to know where did this come from? Where did this come from? And as Abby said, I like to say that it really started with Silence of the Lambs, which I saw when I was, 19 or 20, which was, exactly the age when you would be abducted. And it really kind of traumatized me in a way, because I knew that people were abducted and killed, but I really hadn't thought about the fact that there were even worse things, that you could be abducted and kept alive and under the control of a sadist. So it affected me very deeply, and I decided, or I don't know if I decided consciously, but I think what I was thinking is, well, if I can learn absolutely every single thing about this phenomenon, then I'm going to have control over it, and I'm going to be safe. So every time there was a big story that broke in the papers, I'd read it and follow it all the way to the end, and always follow up on it. And on Sunday mornings, my husband would hand me the Metro section of the paper and say, here, go read your 6 stories. I think he really understood at the time. And then when the internet was a little better on this topic, I could just go and read them for hours and hours and think, okay, I know, I better not do that. And then there started to be, these long-term captives who kept getting released. There was just story after story. And, I knew about Sabine Dardenne, who was the Belgian girl. But then I was really, the one that really struck me originally was the Natasha Campose story. And Natasha Campose was an Austrian girl who was abducted when she was 10 and held captive until she was 18. She's really an extraordinary person and very intelligent. And the way that I found out about that one, I'll never forget the day, because I was walking to work and I walked past a newsstand, and there was, the Daily News or the Post, one of them. And there was this big picture, and I saw it from kind of far away. And it was the room where she was held. It was, pink walls, and it was very cluttered, and it was cluttered in a very disturbing way that suggested that someone had been kept in those confined quarters. And so, I didn't even read the headline, but when I saw this picture, this image was so suggestive that I just immediately kind of went numb. So I bought the paper, and I took it to my office, and there I was working. I was at MTV at the time, and I took it up to my office on the 34th floor, and I closed the door, and I just kind of cried. And I thought, how could this be? How could this be this woman's world? How could this happen? And then I followed her story moving forward, and she is just an incredibly articulate person who was able to really explain this experience and talk about how difficult it was, but more important, she would talk about how she managed to survive. And so that was really my big point of entry into these captivity stories. Is I just kept thinking, well, how do you survive? After you've been through this kind of experience, how do you keep getting up and making your cereal in the morning? And how do you keep moving forward? And can you have any sort of a life? And I also kept thinking, well, what do you have to do in order to survive? How do you have to change? How can you adapt to anything? And how can people do that? How can humans adapt to anything? It's sort of human and inhuman at the same time, because it's the strength that makes us human, but it's at some level it's an animal survival instinct. So I wanted to explore that idea a lot as well. So, and then after that, not very long after, maybe it was a year or two after that, there was the Elizabeth Fritzl case, which to this day is the worst thing I've ever heard in my life. She was also an Austrian woman who was held captive in the basement by her father for 24 years. And she bore him 7 children, one of whom died, and then 3 of whom were taken upstairs, and 3 were kept in the basement with her. And her story is really incredible too. And she also seemed to have this, unbelievable strength that I couldn't understand. And so I followed her stories, and, her story was a very big story. So you would go on Google News and type in Elizabeth Fritzl, and it would turn up 3,096 results. And so I would say, okay, I better settle in and go through these and read them. And then, of course, the stories that people in America are more familiar with, there's, Elizabeth Smart and J.C. Lee Dugard. So, I follow those as well. And also just a recommendation, I recommend to everybody that they read the Natasha Campose memoir, because it's really incredible. But so I had the idea for this book because it almost kind of came to me in a flash, but I had been thinking about, I had been reading a lot of detective fiction, thinking that I wanted to write it. And I wanted to do something different because I felt like so many of the detective, detective in quotes, characters in crime fiction are men. And because really, the way I think about crime fiction is it's kind of a way for us all to try to understand and process evil. And so this detective character was a really important stand-in for us all. And it's usually, though not always, there are a lot more women crime writers now, but often a male. And he's trying to overcome some kind of demons or flaws. But often, he's either an alcoholic or he has commitment issues, even though he's completely irresistible to all women. And so I was thinking about, it would be interesting to have a woman's perspective, and that it would also be interesting to have somebody who had real demons to overcome, that would just sort of up the ante and make it a little more interesting, and have something that they're really trying to get over even as they're solving these crimes. So I had that's when I had the idea to have a woman who has been through this experience, who then is forced into this other situation where she has to go on the hunt, so to speak. So when I just do the short version description of what this book is, I say, imagine it's the woman who was held in the pit in Silence of the Lambs is now hunting Hannibal Lecter. So, it's kind of turning that on its head a little bit. So I had to do, even though my obsessive nature had taught me an awful lot about these stories, still had to do quite a bit of research in order to write this book. So in addition to the news and then nonfiction accounts of these stories, I read all the available memoirs, as a few of them have written them, and that was very potent material and very compelling. And then I also read the court cases, for example, with the Elizabeth Smart. I would just read the entire transcript of the entire case. And I also had to do a lot of research on BDSM, which everyone now knows what that means, bondage, discipline, sadomasochism. And I just want to say for the record that I had completely finished my book before 50 Shades of Grey came out. And I was so furious. I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, now here we go. This is just going to be old hat by the time my book comes out. But my interest in BDSM and the way that it's used narratively in my book is completely different. It's my interest in it is not prurient. It's more that I was interested in the psychological dimensions, because it's this phenomenon that's based on consent, and yet it's consent in a realm where the very thing that you're doing is giving up all of your power. So I just thought there were some interesting ways to investigate that and write about that as well. And then, so I'm going to tell you a few points about the book, and this is particularly for people who are a little bit nervous about reading it. I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, that's too scary. Your book is too scary. I can't read that," or the material is too difficult. But I think I like to explain my approach to it, and I think that can help people understand a little better. Because on the surface, it seems to be, that you would assume that a book that's about torture and abduction and long-term captivity would be a book about female powerlessness and vulnerability. But in fact, this book is about female empowerment and resilience. And, it's really, as much as it is a thriller, which, let me just hasten to add that there's lots of action and excitement and all of that stuff too. But as much as it is a thriller, I also think of it as a trauma recovery memoir. And so what, the journey that this character is taking is that she's really got to, she's facing her past literally and psychologically. And, that's almost as big a part of her journey as solving the crime is figuring out sort of the mystery of her own survival and understanding how she's going to move forward. Because when the book begins, she's done a lot of therapy. She's been escaped for 10 years, but she is very much stuck in her therapy, and she feels that, you know, she can tell these stories, you know, these horrible stories of what has happened to her, but she can't connect with them emotionally anymore. And part of that is, you know, that's how the body protects you in traumatic situations, is that, you know, trauma by definition is, you know, an experience that's so overwhelming that you can't process it at the time, and, you know, you have to process it later over and over. And that's why post-traumatic stress disorder is all about flashbacks. And so, you know, narratively, this book is like that as well. There are flashbacks to her going back, because that's when she's really re-experiencing the trauma, is after it's over. The other thing that was that I really wanted to get right in this book is, this is by definition, it's a book about violence against women, and I consider myself a diehard feminist, and the message of this book is a feminist one. So I wanted to figure out how I was gonna deal with that, how I was gonna include the violence, but not make it exploitative. So what I've done is there's no graphic violence. It's all suggested, so that, you know, that's all you really need, and then you can fill it in with your imagination. But at the same time, sometimes it can be quite suggestive, because you need to understand, the reader needs to understand how serious this experience was and how terrible it was, so that they can fully empathize her and understand her journey. The other thing that I did is, whenever there is a description of violence against women, it's the woman, it's the victim of the violence who's telling the story. And I think that's important, because on the one hand, it makes her the subject of her story rather than the object of her story. But also, you know, for me, it's sort of about how, as you recover and as you heal, it's all about telling the story. And so to have these women each telling their story is kind of moving them all further along as well. And another big theme for this is it's really about, as much as anything, the relationships between the women, because you learn very early on that the other two women who were held captive with Sarah hate her and won't speak to her, and you don't know why. So you learn that over the course of reading the book. But I wanted to do that because I feel like so many times when there is, you know, a terrible, you know, abusive situation, a lot of times the women who are you know, involved are sort of collateral damage, in that they don't turn their anger toward the protagonist, but they turn it on each other. And so I wanted to sort of tease that apart a little bit and explore those relationships, because I think that, you know, particularly for these characters, it was very important for them to resolve those issues among themselves in order to fully heal. So, so those are just a few points. But again, you know, I like to think that you know, if people just want to read it as a beach read, that's fine too. You can read it as a beach read. I think it's hopefully a page turner, but you know, I think there are some other things that are interesting there. There were 4 of us down there for the first 32 months and 11 days of our captivity. And then, very suddenly and without warning, there were 3. Even though the 4th person hadn't made any noise at all in several months, the room got very quiet when she was gone. For a long time after that, we sat in silence, in the dark, wondering which of us would be next in the box. Jennifer and I, of all people, should not have ended up in that cellar. We were not your average 18-year-old girls, abandoning all caution once set loose for the first time on a college campus. We took our freedom seriously and monitored it so carefully it almost didn't exist anymore. We knew what was out there in that big, wide world better than anyone, and we weren't going to let it get us. We had spent years methodically studying and documenting every danger that could possibly ever touch us. Avalanches, disease, earthquakes, car crashes, sociopaths, and wild animals. All the evils that might lurk outside our window. We believed our paranoia would protect us. After all, what are the odds that two girls so well versed in disaster would be the ones to fall prey to it? For us, there was no such thing as fate. Fate was a word you used when you had not prepared, when you were slack, when you stopped paying attention. Fate was a weak man's crutch. Our caution, which verged on a mania by our late teens, had started 6 years earlier when we were 12. On a cold but sunny January day in 1991, Jennifer's mother drove us home from school the same as every other weekday. I don't even remember the accident. I only recall slowly emerging into the light to the beat of the heart monitor as it chirped out the steady and comforting rhythm of my pulse. For many days after that, I felt warm and utterly safe when I first woke up, until that moment when my heart sank and my mind caught up with time. Jennifer would tell me later that she remembered the crash vividly. Her memory was typically post-traumatic, a hazy slow-motion dream with colors and lights all swirling together in a kind of operatic brilliance. They told us we were lucky, having been only seriously injured and living through the ICU with its blur of doctors, nurses, needles, and tubes, and then 4 months recovering in a bare hospital room with CNN blaring in the background. Jennifer's mother had not been lucky. They put us in a room together, ostensibly so we could keep each other company for our convalescence, and, as my mother told me in a whisper, so I could help Jennifer through her grief. But I suspected the other reason was that Jennifer's father, who was divorced from her mother and an erratic drunk we had always taken pains to avoid, was only too happy when my parents volunteered to take turns sitting with us. At any rate, as our bodies slowly healed, we were left alone more often, and it was then that we started the journals. To pass the time, we said to ourselves, both probably knowing deep down that it was in fact to help us feel some control over a wild and unjust universe. The first journal was merely a notepad from our bedside table at the hospital, with Joan's Memorial printed in Romanesque block letters across the top. Few would have recognized it as a journal, filled as it was only with lists of the horrors we saw on television. We had to ask the nurses for 3 more notepads. They must have thought we were filling our days with tic-tac-toe or hangman. In any event, no one thought to change the channel. When we got out of the hospital, we worked on our project in earnest. At the school library, we found almanacs, medical journals, and even a book of actuarial tables from 1987. We gathered data, we computed, and we recorded, filling up line after line with the raw evidence of human vulnerability. The journals were initially divided into 8 basic categories, but as we got older, we learned with horror how many things there were that were worse than plane crashes, household accidents, and cancer. In stone silence and after careful deliberation, as we sat in the sunny, cheerful window seat of my bright attic bedroom, Jennifer wrote out the new headings in bold black letters with her Sharpie: abduction, rape, and murder. The statistics gave us such comfort. Knowledge is power, after all. We knew we had a 1 in 2 million chance of being killed by a tornado, a 1 in 310,000 chance of dying in a plane crash, and a 1 in 500,000 chance of being killed by an asteroid hitting Earth. In our warped view of probability, the very fact that we had memorized this endless slate of figures somehow changed our odds for the better. Magical thinking, our therapists would later call it, in the year after I came home to find all 17 of the journals in a pile on our kitchen table, and both my parents sitting there waiting with tears in their eyes. By then I was 16, and Jennifer had come to live with us full-time because her father was in jail after his 3rd DUI. We visited him, taking the bus because we had decided it wasn't safe for us to drive at that age. It would be another 1.5 years before either of us got a license. I had never liked her father, and it turned out she hadn't either. Looking back, I don't know why we visited him at all, but we did, like clockwork, on the first Saturday of every month. Mostly he just looked at her and cried. Sometimes he would try to start a sentence, but he never got very far. Jennifer didn't bat an eye, just stared at him with as blank an expression as I ever saw on her face, even when we were down in that cellar. The 2 of them never spoke, and I sat a little way from them, fidgeting and uncomfortable. Her father was the only thing she would not discuss with me, not one word, so I just held her hand on the bus back home each time, while she gazed out the window in silence. The summer before we went off to Ohio University, our anxieties reached a fever pitch. We would soon be leaving my attic room, which we shared, and go into the vast unknown, a college campus. In preparation, we made the never list and hung it on the back of our bedroom door. Jennifer, who was plagued by insomnia, would often get up in the middle of the night to add to it. Never go to the campus library alone at night. Never park more than 6 spaces from your destination. Never trust a stranger with a flat tire. Never, never, never. Before we left, we meticulously packed a trunk, filling it with the treasures we had collected over the years at birthdays and Christmases. Face masks, antibacterial soap, flashlights, pepper spray. We chose a dorm in a low building so that, in the event of fire, we could easily make the jump. We painstakingly studied the campus map and arrived 3 days early to examine the footpaths and walkways to evaluate for ourselves the lighting, visibility, and proximity to public spaces. When we arrived at our dorm, Jennifer took out her tools before we had even unpacked our bags. She drilled a hole in our window sash, and I inserted small but strong metal bars through the wood so it couldn't be opened from the outside even if the glass was broken. We kept a rope ladder by the window, along with a set of pliers to remove the metal bars in the event we needed a quick escape. We got special permission from campus security to add a deadbolt lock to our door. As a final touch, Jennifer gingerly hung the Never List on the wall between our beds, and we surveyed the room with satisfaction. Maybe the universe played out a perverse justice on us in the end. Or maybe the risks of living in the outside world were simply greater than we had calculated. In any event, I suppose we stepped out of our own bounds by trying to live a semblance of regular college life. Really, I thought later, we knew better. But at the same time, the lure of the ordinary proved to be too irresistible. We went to classes separately from each other, even if we had to go to opposite ends of the campus. We stayed in the library talking to new friends well after dark sometimes. We even went to a couple of campus mixers sponsored by the university, just like normal kids. In fact, after only 2 months there, I secretly began thinking we could start living more like other people. I thought maybe the worries of our youth could be put away, packed safely in the cardboard boxes back home where we stored our other childhood memorabilia. I thought, in what I now see as a heretical break from everything we stood for, that maybe our juvenile obsessions were just that, and we were finally growing up. Thankfully, I never articulated those thoughts to Jennifer, much less acted on them, so I was able to half forgive myself for them in those dark days and nights to follow. We were just college kids, doing what college kids do, but I could comfort myself knowing we had followed our protocols to the bitter end. We had almost automatically executed our protective strategies with a military precision and focus, every day a continuous safety drill. Every activity had a 3-point check, a rule, and a backup plan. We were on our guard. We were careful. That night was no different. Before we had even arrived on campus, we had researched which car service in town had the best record for accidents, and we'd set up an account. We had it billed directly to our credit cards just in case we ever ran out of cash or had our wallets stolen. Never be stranded was number 37 on the list, after all. 2 months into the semester, the dispatch guy recognized our voices. We only had to give him a pickup address, and moments later we would be safely shuttled back to our dormitory fortress. That night we went to a private party off campus. A first for us. Things were just getting going at around midnight when we decided we'd push the limit far enough. We called the service, and in record time a beat-up black sedan arrived. We noticed nothing out of the ordinary until we were in the car with our seatbelts fastened. There was a funny smell, but I shrugged it off, deciding it was within the realm of the expected for a local livery company. A couple of minutes into the ride, Jennifer dozed off with her head on my shoulder. That memory, the last of our other life, is preserved in my imagination in a perfect halo of peace. I felt satisfied. I was looking forward to life, a real life. We were moving on. We were going to be happy. I must have drifted off, too, because when I opened my eyes, we were in total darkness in the back seat, the lights of the town replaced by the dim glow of stars. The black sedan was hurtling forward on the now deserted highway, with only the faint trace of the horizon ahead. This was not the way home. At first I panicked. Then I remembered number 7 on the never list, never panic. In a flash, my mind retraced our steps that day, pointlessly trying to figure out where we had made the mistake. Because there had to have been a mistake. This was not our fate. Bitterly, I realized we had made the most basic and fundamental error of all. Every mother taught her child the same simple safety rule, the most obvious one on our own list. Never get in the car. In our hubris, we'd thought we could cheat it, just a little, with our logic, our research, our precautions. But nothing could change the fact that we'd failed to follow the rule absolutely. We'd been naive. We hadn't believed other minds could be as calculating as ours. We hadn't counted on actual evil as our enemy rather than blind statistical possibility. There in the car, I drew 3 deep breaths and looked at Jennifer's sweet sleeping face for a long, sad moment. I knew as soon as I acted that, for the second time in her young life, she would wake up into a life utterly transformed. Finally, with great dread, I took her shoulder in my hand and shook it gently. She was bleary-eyed at first. I held my finger to my lips as her eyes focused and she began to process our situation. When I saw the look of realization and fear dawning on her face, I whimpered almost audibly, but stifled the sound with my hand. Jennifer had been through too much and suffered so hard. She could not survive this without me. I had to be strong. Neither of us made a sound. We had trained ourselves never to act impulsively in an emergency situation, and this was definitely an emergency. Through the thick, clear plastic partition dividing us from the driver, we could see very little of our abductor. Dark brown hair, black wool coat, large hands on the wheel. On the left side of his neck, partially hidden by his collar, was a small tattoo that I couldn't quite make out in the dark. The rearview mirror was angled up so we could see almost nothing of his face. As quietly as we could, we tested the door handles. Safety locked. The window mechanisms were disabled as well. We were trapped. Jennifer slowly leaned down and picked up her bag from the floor, keeping her eyes on me as she rummaged in it silently. She pulled out her pepper spray. I shook my head, knowing it was of no use to us in our sealed-off space. Still, we felt safer having it. I dug into my own purse at my feet. I found an identical canister and a small handheld alarm with a panic button. We would have to wait it out, in silence, in terror, with our shaking hands clutching our pepper sprays and sweat beating our foreheads despite the October chill outside. I scanned the interior of the car, trying to come up with a plan, and then I noticed it. There were small open air vents in the partition on my side, but those in front of Jennifer were connected to some kind of homemade metal and rubber contraption. Valves were connected to a pipe that disappeared from our view into the front floorboard. I sat very still, gaping at this intricate mechanism, my mind racing but unable to grasp a coherent thought for a moment. Finally, it sank in. "We'll be drugged," I said at last, whispering to Jennifer. I looked down at the pepper spray in my hand with regret, knowing I'd never be able to use it. I stroked it almost lovingly, then let it drop to the floor as I stared back up at the source of our impending doom. Jennifer followed my glance and registered at once what it meant. There was no hope. He must have heard me speak, for just seconds later, a slight hissing sound told us we were about to get very sleepy. The air vents on my side slid shut. Jennifer and I held hands tightly, our other hands gripping the outer sides of the faux leather seat as the world slipped away. When I came to, I was in the dark cellar that was to be my home for more than 3 years. I roused myself from the drugs slowly, trying to focus my eyes in the sea of gray that swam before them. When they finally cleared, I had to shut them tightly again to stop the panic that threatened to take over. I waited 10 seconds, 20, 30, and opened again. I looked down at my body. I was stripped naked and chained to the wall by my ankle. A chill prickled up my spine and my stomach lurched. I was not alone. There were 2 other girls down there, emaciated, naked, and chained to the walls beside me. In front of us was the box. It was a simple wooden shipping crate of some sort, maybe 5 feet long by 4 feet high. Its opening was angled away from me, so I couldn't tell how it was secured. There was a dim bulb hanging from the ceiling over us. It swayed just slightly. Jennifer was nowhere to be seen.
I know you were not inspired by 50 Shades of Grey, as you explained.
That's right.
However, what were the books or who were the authors who really were sort of perched on your shoulder as you were writing?
Yeah. Well, I always hesitate to even say their names because in no way am I comparing myself to these writing gods. But, one of my biggest, I'll tell you, my favorite crime writers are really Patricia Highsmith and Graham Greene and Henning Mankell and Shirley Jackson. And I think that, I read for the time that I was writing this book and really even the 2 years before, I was really on a Scandinavian crime fiction jag, and I read them all, and I love them all, even the ones that really aren't even that great. I just love that atmosphere. I love the, driving through the woods of Scandia in the snow, and, I really love that stuff. So I was reading a lot of that. Shirley Jackson, a lot of people know her for The Lottery, but my favorite works of hers are actually the 2 novels, The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle. And We Have Always Lived in the Castle is this amazing, perfect gem of a novella that I recommend to everyone. It's so wonderful. But The Haunting of Hill House, which is a little weirder, and I hesitate to recommend it to people because it's super weird and not everybody's going to like it, and it's a little strange and uneven, but it's a magnificent book as well. And what I really love about her writing is that she wants to really dig deep into the way that people think and the way that they feel, and in a way that's really shedding whatever logic there is, and is stripping it down to this really emotional state. And one example that I give is that there's this wonderful scene in The Haunting of Hill House where the main character, who's, she's kind of escaping a bunch of craziness in her life, and she's driving to go spend the week in this haunted house with some people who study haunted houses, right? And this woman, who's the protagonist of the book, is a lot off kilter. And so she stops at a restaurant, and there's a little girl and her parents at the table next to them, and the little girl won't drink her milk out of the cup that she's given, and she says, I want my cup of stars, I want my cup of stars. And Eleanor, the character, strikes her, and she says, don't give up, don't let them make you give up your cup of stars, because once you give that up, it's all lost. I don't know the exact quote, but it's just like this incredibly passionate connection that she's having that is, of course, unrelated to the actual experience, but it says it all. So I always just think, I'm not going to give up my cup of stars. It's like one of my things I write on my Post-it, put it by my computer. Don't let them take your cup of stars.
Seems like part of the genre, as you've explained it. I don't really, I'm not a reader of mainly of these books, although I loved your book. And as you've explained it, is a cathartic experience, right, for the reader, that you emotionally enter what is an incredibly tense and sometimes sort of painful experience, and then there's some catharsis in it. And certainly your book in particular seems like it's very much about that for the characters, right? And I wonder if the writing of it for you was cathartic, and because it seems as if it has that quality to it, and I wonder in what way it is.
It was incredibly cathartic. Definitely, there were a lot of issues that have been bouncing around in my head for years, like wondering about these things and thinking about traumatic experiences and bad experiences and victimhood and all of those sorts of things, and just not really feeling like I was able to answer these questions. And somehow, I don't know, these are questions that don't really get answered ever. But so I always say, well, I don't know if I'm really that much closer to answers on all of this, but the emotional experience of writing it was so powerful. And I have to say that there were a lot of scenes in here that even now, if I kind of read them, I tear up a little bit. I don't know that anyone else would experience it that way, but they are very powerfully emotional to me. And it was often very hard to write this book because you are having to go into a very dark place and think about very dark issues. And so I was able to compartmentalize it, writing from my 5 to 6 in the morning, and then I would have my dark time writing in the dark before the sun came up, and I wrote in a stone basement, and I could kind of go through that experience, and then I'd have to get up, go upstairs, get my kids up, get them ready for school, pack lunches, and then go to my regular full-time job as a lawyer. So it was important to be able to keep all those things separate. But yeah, very cathartic.
I kind of want to piggyback off that question,
okay.
Actually. What kind of amazed me during your reading is just how matter of fact and procedural the narration was from your protagonist, from the narrator. Was that did you see her originally like that? Did you see her as being really like a detective, the way she's talking throughout that scene? It kind of scared me almost, just how objectively she was like, this is what happened.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you think about that's where she was at the beginning of the book. She could say it, you know, and she goes to her therapist and says, "Oh yes, this happens," and then she describes this completely terrible thing, but she's disconnected from the story at that point in the book, and so yeah, she's just matter-of-factly laying it out. This is what happens. And then later in the book, when she's struggling over her own inability to recover, you will feel more frustration in her in the way she tells the story, because she's, you know, kind of annoyed with herself. Like, why do I keep backtracking? Why can't I be normal? Why can't I relate to these things? And then, you know, then even later there are scenes where she starts to realize what she's lost by that sort of dissociation.
This one. So I want to go back to those 5 a.m. mornings in your basement. And was that a terrifying place to be in terms of starting out something totally different, like totally different career change, or not even knowing that anyone would read it, like you said? Was it a terrifying place to be, or kind of a liberating place to be? Or at what point did you feel confidence that you had something that, or ever, did you ever feel that until you had sent it out? And my other question is, does that, you're in a very different place now writing, since you've, you know, crossed over that hump. Is it harder now, or was it harder the first time?
Well, when I first did it, it was really just a little, you know, a personal project for me. You know, I had no idea that it would result in any career change. I thought in the best possible scenario, maybe some small mystery press would publish it, or, you know, I didn't know. I just really wanted to try it, because for all my life I had been thinking that that I was really this one thing, and I had spent 16 years as something else. And so, you know, I finally said, okay, well, you know, let's see what you got, because maybe there's nothing. And then I thought, then I could be reconciled to being a lawyer, and I could really be happier doing it. So it wasn't scary. I was totally excited to do it. I mean, definitely there were days when I woke up and I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it, but I was so afraid that if I ever once missed my word count, then I wouldn't pick it up again. So I forced myself always to do it. But it was, I just thought it was fun. And I don't know why I was so driven to finish it, but I was. And then as for the second book, yeah, it's a totally different experience, because I know that people will read it, and that, you know, there's going to be, you know, like my agent would say, where is it? What's going on with it? But I feel like for going forward, I just have to shut every single bit of that out, because, and also, you know, it changes because you get feedback on the first book, and then you see what people liked or didn't like, and it's so tempting to say, oh, this is what the marketplace wants, or I have to have the exact right high concept idea because this is what the publishing world wants. But I just feel like if you're writing from that place, it's not going to be good. So for me, you know, now I live up in the country, totally away from all this stuff. I'm just going to go into my kitchen or my office or whatever, and not try very hard not to think about any of it, and think about what's the thing that I really want to write. And especially because now that I've seen how much time you have to spend with this book and how many times I will have to read it. So it's got to keep my interest. It's got to be something I feel really deeply about. And I think for me, it can't just be about plot, or even plot and character. In order for me to stay interested in it, I have to have animating ideas for it, whether that's something that people see or care about at all. It doesn't matter, because I just know what I have to do in order for me to really put my emotions into it. Because I feel like I'm, you know, when I wrote this book, it was like very method. It's like kind of method writing. I had to really, really feel it and really, really be a part of those characters. And you can't do that if you're not there emotionally with them.